And good morning. I know the first question that I'm going to be asked, because I've already been asked it several times, is why are you wearing a jacket? And there's actually several reasons. First of all, there's a lot more pockets. Of course, there's also the opportunity for things to fall out of the pockets, and my water bottle's here on the pew. And I need that. But I've got the water bottles, I've got the mints, we got a little bit of everything. I mean, it was a little bit chilly this morning, so I would have worn a jacket anyway, and I just figured let's just wear the jacket that I don't have to take off. Wasn't going to wear I should have worn my Phillies jacket up here on stage, but I'm not going to go that far. Some of you might not be Phillies fans, I understand. And some of you will be able to relate many, many years ago when Pastor Zabolski was here and all he talked about were the Buffalo Bills. Remember those days? And how every year the Bills would lose the Super Bowl. And we felt bad for him, kind of. But and there's actually going to be a point a little bit later in the message where it's going to be good that I have a jacket on, and you'll see that when we get to it. But I'm happy to be here. Pastor asked me several weeks ago if I would fill in, excuse me, when he realized he had the chance to get away for a couple days with Ava having several days off from school. Happy to fill in. Last time I filled in was back in February. And that was right around the time where we were announcing, both as a church and as myself as an individual, that we were going to start to go this route of starting a ministry for drug addiction, a 12-step program, which we have started that. We're meeting on Wednesday evenings over in the community classroom. But we also announced at the same time that I was also going to start taking classes and working toward another degree in the addiction counseling degree program. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of update on that. By midnight tonight, and I say midnight because I have to go home and still write probably 3 to 4 more pages of a paper. But by midnight tonight, I will have finished 4 classes. And we still have a little bit of ways to go, but I'm enjoying it. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. But just to see where God's going to take this, I don't know. But it's something that I'm excited about. And then I have a week off, and we start the next class next Monday. And that goes and then we have anyway, you don't need to know all that. But last week, one of the things that Pastor Sanders said in his message, he pointed out to us, the Bible is not an old book. It is a timeless book. And I'm going to take us through a little bit of Old Testament history for a few moments. We're going to be looking at the call of Moses. I wish I had 4 or 5 Sundays, or I wish I had an hour and a half, which I don't have either, because we could really get into this. But in conjunction with what he is now speaking about with Jonah, and we did not orchestrate this together. And in fact, I didn't even realize, because I don't necessarily pay real close attention to things, that he was even speaking about Jonah until I came to church last Sunday, and as I was sitting there listening to him speak about his introductory material about Jonah, I thought, wow, this is just so cool how God is going to tie these two together in the next 2 weeks, even though I'm not going to say anything at all about Jonah. But it's just the idea of when God calls, he's going to provide. And I want to take you back before we get to Exodus chapter 3, which is where we're going to be. And if you're going to be using one of the Pew Bibles, Exodus 3 is found on page 46. It's near the beginning of the Bible, but let me give you a little bit of background, a little bit of history. And we have to go back, way back, probably about 400 years prior to this. And God is speaking to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. And Abraham has been given this promise from God that he's going to have many descendants, he's going to have children, and at this point he does not have any yet. And God reiterates the promise in Genesis chapter 15. And in fact, he turns it not only just a promise, but when you read through Genesis 15, and we're not going to get into the details of that, you see that Genesis 15 is actually an ancient Near Eastern contract with what goes on in that chapter. So God solidifies it with Abraham. I promise this is what I'm going to do for you. And then they solidify it with a contract. But in the context of that contract, God also makes this promise to Abraham, and he says, but there's going to be a point when your family, when your descendants, they're going to be caught in the context of another nation, and they're going to be held as slaves for 400 years. That's a prophecy that God makes in Genesis 15. We get to Exodus chapter 3, and that 400-year time period is about over. And the people the Israelites in Egypt, they did not have the book of Genesis, they did not have the book of Exodus that they could sit down and read, but I'm sure they had their oral histories. And I'm sure they had the messages that had been passed on from generation to generation. And even though we're talking about 400 years with the men living to be 150, 175 years old still, we're not talking about lots and lots of generations. And so the people in the days of Moses, especially at the time period when Moses is born, and you probably know that story of how Moses is born into a time period that is very, very dangerous to be an infant boy in the Israelite family. And the Pharaoh is fearful that this prophecy or this theory or philosophy that's now permeating through the people of Israel, that they're expecting some type of deliverer or a redeemer. And he's going to try to put a stop to that. And he orders the killing of all of the Israelite boys 2 years old and younger. And you read through the beginning of Exodus and you see how Moses is spared from that. And how just because of the way God worked and enabled for him to not lose his life, but rather to be brought up, to be raised in the courts of Pharaoh. And so the first 40 years of Moses' life, he spends as a prince in Egypt, going through all of the education and all of the benefits that you would receive if you're a prince in Egypt. We don't know exactly what he was doing or how that played out in his life. Was Moses involved in the building of the pyramids? We don't know. Some people think maybe he was. But he was a very educated man. I think we can be very, very confident in that. But at some point, and the text is not, I don't mean to say it's not clear, but there's just some details about the story that God just chooses that we don't need to know. And at some point, and this is recorded very briefly in chapter 2 of Exodus, that Moses understands that he's an Israelite. And whether he's starting to feel as though he wants to stand up for the Israelites, or maybe he's feeling that he would like to be the one, and maybe he can orchestrate a freeing of his own people. And we have the story of a very, very brief instance in Exodus chapter 2 where Moses commits murder. And he knows what he's doing. And in fact, the text tells us that he looked this way and that way. And seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. So he knew what he was doing. And he's probably at this point thinking, God's going to use me. God's going to use me to deliver the nation. And what he had done is he had killed an Egyptian that was abusing one of the Israelites. But we find out that very shortly after that people know about what has happened. And some of the Israelite people confront him about it. When he steps in and tries to stop, in the very next paragraph, he tries to stop a fight that's going on between two Israelites. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" And he answered, "Who are you? Who made you a prince and judge over this? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Ooh. I thought I hid that guy's body pretty good. Word's gotten out. And we're told that he flees. We're told that Pharaoh is now taking steps to kill Moses, and Moses runs. And he runs to the land of Midian. And he's now out in the desert. If you're a fan of Chuck Swindoll in several different places in his books and in his broadcasts describes, because he's been there quite a few times, describes what it looks like in that part of the world. And his descriptions are very, very clear when he says there's no green anywhere. There's no green. It's just barren. It's barren. I've never been there. So I'm taking the word from a guy that's been there numerous times. This does not sound like a real fun place to live. And if you look and we don't know exactly where Moses was in Egypt, but the distance to what we believe is Mount Sinai, where he's going to end up, is probably about 100 miles. So he's fleeing. And he's running, and maybe his travels take him 100 miles away, out in the middle of nowhere. And it's kind of interesting that we find out at the end of verse 15 that he sits down by a well. Little bit of reprieve. And he meets a family, and this guy Jethro invites him to, "Hey, you want to help me take care of my sheep?" So now remember, we've got a guy that's gone from being a prince in Egypt, and now his only job offer is, "Hey, do you want to help me take care of my sheep?" That's quite a switch. That's quite a switch. And he responds, yes. He'd been in Egypt for 40 years. Now we're told that he's going to be a shepherd for 40 years. 40 years. One of the real neat things about my life is that I enjoy the work that I do every day. I hope you can say that. The job that you have where God has placed you, where God has placed me and enabled me to be a school teacher, primarily teaching middle school kids. And I've said that before here. I enjoy it. I like getting up and going to work in the morning. I like weekends. I like long weekends. Columbus Day, looking pretty good tomorrow. But I can't imagine Moses waking up every single day for 40 years. Yes, I get to be a shepherd today. I get to take care of sheep. 40 years. 40 years. And that leads us to the passage where I want to focus on. And I'd like to take the time to read. So I'm going to read beginning in Exodus chapter 3. And I'm going to read down through verse 12. So if you just want to follow along in your Bible. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet. For the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. And I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. I imagine after 37, 38, 39 years of doing this, that Moses is probably past the feeling or the idea that maybe something exciting is going to happen today. I don't think this is on his radar at all. And he gets up this morning, and whether he's out on the side of the hill or how this plays out, we don't know. We do know that this was not probably some massive fire, because the way that this style of bush is described in the Old Testament, it's just a bush. It's not this massive tree. It's a bush. Some people have suggested that this was nothing more than some types of bushes in that part of the country grow bright red leaves, or they have bright red small berries on them, and it was just the light reflecting off of that. That's not what the text says. The text says that the bush was burning and it was not being consumed. And it caught Moses' attention. And so he goes over to it. And all of a sudden he hears a voice. And it's God. The text identifies the angel of the Lord. There are numerous times in the Old Testament where the phrase, the angel of the Lord, is used to refer to, most likely, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. So this could very likely be, and it probably is, Jesus himself speaking to him in this pre-incarnate state. And it's very clearly not just an angel. There are not instances where angels are announcing you're on holy ground, take your shoes off. But that's what's going on here. So here he is, 80 years old. He's been shepherding for 40 years. Life's probably got to the point where it's just get up in the morning, do what I need to do. And all of a sudden, God's speaking to him. He's mentally not ready for this. And I know, there's times in our own lives where God catches us off guard. God all of a sudden puts something in your life or in my life that we are not expecting. It could be an offer of ministry. It could be some type of trial that we were not expecting. You go back and read through the book of Job, and you saw that Job was not expecting that at all. In fact, we're told that Job was a was a godly man who regularly would worship and offer sacrifices on behalf of his children. So he's worshiping and he's trying to intercede for his children, and all of a sudden, in the course of one afternoon, he finds out that not only has he lost all of his possessions, but all 10 of his children have died in a storm. And how does he respond? It says that he throws ashes on his head, he tears his clothes, and he worships. He worships. And I think that comes about because that's his natural reaction to a difficult time in life. And he's able to do that because of his relationship to God. It's not something that he has to pull out his textbooks or notes of sermons. Okay, how do I do this? What happens next? His natural inclination was to worship. So I'm not in any way condemning Moses for his response here, because God's hitting with something that he's not expecting. But there's going to be times when God hits us with things we're not expecting. And what we have here, first of all, is that God says, and we see it, God's approachable. God is there, and he's come looking for Moses, and he invites Moses to interact with him. And that's the kind of God we have. We have a God who, on occasion, is going to reach out to us. We have a God who's given us his word. We have a God who very clearly wants us to know about him. He even says on several different occasions in the scriptures that we can know some things about him just by looking at creation, just by looking at how he has made us. Over the summer, I spent most of my summer steam cleaning carpets here. Quite the job. I enjoy it because I also, for Father's Day, my daughter gave me a subscription to Audible books. And I don't know how many books I listened to over the summer here while I was steam cleaning carpets. It was really cool. And one of the books was, I remember the name of the author right now, but it was Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. And it's a book written by a missionary and a Christian doctor who served in India for years. And the book is written of the concept of how fabulous the human body is. And what a neat book, explaining over and over and over the various systems of our body, whether it's the circulatory system, the pain system, and I know there's probably a more advanced word for that, but he just went on and on about how we need to feel pain and why it's important that we do, or how our brain functions. And all of the details that God has put into our life in so many different ways just to make our physical bodies work the way they do. And God wants us to know him. And he's given us these things, whether it's ourselves or our appreciation of his creation, or the ability to feel pleasure. And he's created us differently than the rest of creation. And he said, I want you to be like me. And then he's given us some things about it. Here's what I'm like. And so there he is. He creates Adam as in the image of God and given us the desire and the ability to want to be like him, to worship him and to honor him. And Moses here is being invited by God to approach. And he's, oh boy, this is something. So he does, he approaches. But God says to him, do not come near till you take your shoes off, because I'm a holy God. And this just shouts, it just shouts the importance of coming to God on his terms, not on our own terms, not on our, well, I'm sure God's going to honor my best efforts, or, I don't think God's going to judge us if we do our best or if we try hard. That's not what the scriptures teach. The Bible clearly teaches us that we approach God on his terms. And Jesus said it very clearly there in the upper room in John 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. There's not all roads lead to heaven, and there's not as long as you're doing your best, God's going to honor that. That's not what God says. The problem is we've got a sin problem. And we can't fix that sin problem. And unless God steps in and fixes that sin problem for us, we're incapable of fixing that problem. The greatest problem that man has to face, we can't fix it. Okay? Every once in a while, Linda will say something to you. Can you fix this? And most of the time, the answer is no. I'm not a handyman at all. Not a bit. Not a bit. Absolutely. I hear the stories. Mike comes over and, he's doing this or this or this. And I'm thinking, I get up, I can read, I can study, I can ride my bike, but don't put a hammer or a screwdriver in my hand. It's not going to turn out well. I don't know how many times back in the old days when we used to work on our cars by ourselves, and maybe some of you still do. There's no way I'm going to ever do anything working on my car. I can think of two specific times where I was trying to fix something on my car. I just made it worse. One time we had to push my car to the garage because it was completely inoperable because of something I tried to do to fix it. I've learned my lessons. So Linda says, can you? No. Call your son. Just call your son. And, he can do anything. And he's got all the tools. Just call him. But, oh my. The God of the universe wants to know us. And he has said, here's who I am. But you need to come to me on my terms. And so as Moses is standing here out in the middle of nowhere, and he sees this bush burning, and God calls to him, God uses his name, Moses, but take your shoes off because this is holy ground. It's not holy ground because this area here has been roped off. It's holy ground because that's where God is. And as long as God is there, and once God's gone and that bush is there, it's not holy ground. But in the presence of God, think of that picture in Isaiah chapter 6 where Isaiah is taken into the throne room of God in Isaiah chapter 6. And he's hearing the angels crying out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And Isaiah is fearful. I can't be here until the angels take the steps to purify him. Or think about what happens in Revelation chapter 1. I love this illustration. John the Apostle has written the book of Revelation. He's in the process of seeing this vision. God is giving him a vision about the future. And in the very beginning of the vision, he sees Jesus. And Jesus is approaching him. And think of the relationship that John and Jesus had when they were on the earth. Okay, John describes himself in his gospel as the disciple that Jesus loved. It's possible that they were first cousins. They were probably very, very close. Maybe they grew up together. There seems to be some evidence that once Jesus started his ministry, that Jesus was possibly living with James and John there in the city of Capernaum. That ended up being their home base. We don't know for sure. But we know these two guys are close. And this is 60 years after the resurrection. They haven't laid eyes on each other since Jesus ascended back up into heaven. Knowing the relationship that these two have, how does John react there in Revelation 1 when he sees Jesus and Jesus approaches him? He doesn't run up and give him a hug. Oh, I missed you. It says he fell down on his face as a dead man. He was in the presence of his God. And he got on his knees with his face to the ground and he worshiped. If that's the way John responds to Jesus, it's a good illustration of how we do. Now, I don't think we're going to spend all of eternity on our faces. I think it's not going to be that way, so I'm not expressing that. But there in that instance, we see worship. Here in Exodus chapter 3, God is saying to Moses, you've got to understand who I am. And the response is worship. He says, I love the fact that God establishes a relationship. He reminds Moses. And how long has it been since Moses has even thought about this? 40 years ago, he did this thing in Egypt and he fled. Does he get up every morning thinking about it, worrying about it? Probably not. And all of a sudden, God appears to him and reminds him, I am the God of your father who he has had no contact with. And I don't mean Abraham specifically, but there's no indication that Moses has had any contact with any of the Israelites for the last 40 years. And God reminds him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Excuse me. And then he gets into the next paragraph from verse 7 down through 9. And he points out all the things that make it obvious that God is aware of what's going on. He says, I heard your cry. I've come down to deliver. I know your sufferings. I'm going to bring them up out of the land. I've seen the oppression. All of these phrases that are there used in that passage to assure Moses that I know what's going on. I'm going to take care of this. Have you felt on occasion that maybe God wasn't there? Go back to Job a little bit. Job felt that way. But then again, there in the beginning, there's no indication in the beginning of that story that God immediately appeared to Job. In fact, it appears that he does not. But Job's spiritual life, his spiritual walk in some way, enables him to have the strength to be able to face what has just occurred. He's going to go through some real trials when these three friends show up. And the first week of that situation, the friends just sit there with him and they console him and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But then all of a sudden, they start to speak and they just make Job feel horrible because of their false accusations, that trying to convince Job, this has really happened because of these various things you've done, which was just not true. And Job, rather than being consoled by friends as he's going through these incredible trials, is now fighting off the false accusations of the friends. And it really changes Job's perspective in that he becomes bitter. And he attacks God somewhat. And God has to set him in his place there at the end of the book. But here God is assuring Moses, I know what's going on. God is not going to, every single time we go through something, swoop down, pick us up, carry us. We've got the scriptures. We've got the promises that he's there. Sometimes it doesn't feel like he is, but he's promised that he is. And think about with a little child. If every time a little child struggled a little bit with walking and we picked them up, they wouldn't learn. There's got to be some walking. There's got to be some growth that occurs. And so at least I know in my personal life, I know that there's going to be times where, I feel like I'm going through this dry time. I'm feeling like, God's not real close to me. He's there. He is. And at least for me, I believe he's expecting me to walk the way he's told me to walk without some kind of assistance from him other than what he's already given me. And I hope that makes sense to you. And those are the times when, at least for me in my life, where I'm able to then, and again, I'm not in any way saying this is my strength, this is my strength, this is his strength, but it's him giving it to me through the promises he's already given. And you come out the other side. And think of Psalm 23. Oh boy. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you're with me. That's a difficult time. When that psalmist wrote that, he wasn't talking about we're going to skirt around it or we're going to let's ease up here until the bad parts of life looks like they're developing. We're just going to rest here and then we'll proceed. There's some times where we go right through messes. God says he's there. And we need to rely on him, but not expect him to do the picking up and carrying the way maybe we think we need it. Sometimes it's going to be the prodding of keep moving, keep moving. At least that's what I see in my own life. And it's cool here that as God has told Moses, here, I know what's going on. I promised you 400 years ago that there was going to be this trial for 400 years. Now we're going to fix it. Now we're going to fix it. So at this point, maybe Moses is getting a little bit excited until verse 10, and he hears the word, come. And Moses immediately responds, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God does not answer Moses' question. God does not point out to Moses, bud, you are absolutely the most qualified person to do this. You've already spent 40 years in the courts of Egypt. You know how the politics and the government of Egypt operates. You know this desert probably more than anyone. You have just been prepared 80 years. John Davis, who was a great Old Testament scholar, I think he taught at Grace in Indiana for many, many years. He points out that the first two chapters of Exodus describe the plight of Israel and the preparation of the deliverer. We've got two full chapters where Moses is being prepared for now what's going to happen when he's 80 years old. And his first reaction is, not me. Nope, not going to be happening. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God doesn't respond with, well, let me tell you who you are, but rather God responds with, I will be with you. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your qualifications are. I am going to be with you. I'm going to take you through this, and through these next two chapters, which describe the different scenes of Moses saying yes, or not saying yes, but of coming up with different reasons as to why he shouldn't go. And God continually reiterating, but they will listen, but they will respond, but they will. And each time he comes up with a different excuse. I compare this to the point in the Gospels where Jesus finally announces to the disciples, we're on our way to Jerusalem. When we get to Jerusalem, they're going to arrest me. They're going to crucify me. And 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. And do you remember what Peter's response was? Lord, we won't let that happen to you. Peter, did you hear the end of that? 3 days later, I will rise again. And all Peter heard was, we're not going to let that happen to you. That's not going to be the case. And I don't know that Moses cares all of the promises that God gives him here. I'm trying to put myself in this position. How would I feel? I'd be nervous, obviously. There's no way I'm going to stand here and tell you, oh, I don't know what was wrong with Moses. I would have jumped at this chance. I don't think there's anybody in the room that would have said, yeah, send me to talk to Pharaoh. So he says, who am I? God assures him, I'll be with you. We don't have time to look at all of the specifics of the next 4 questions or situations that Moses proposes. But the next one is where he says, I'm going to get there. The Israelites, they're not going to listen to me. What am I supposed to say? Who sent me? They're going to ask me, who is it that sent you? What right do you have? I mean, that was the last thing he heard before he left Egypt. What right do you have to be a judge over us? And maybe he's thinking they're going to say the same thing. And this is where God announces and makes the great proclamation to Moses that you tell them I am has sent you. The all-sufficient one, the I am that I am. God reveals himself to Moses in the phrasing of the term Yahweh or Jehovah. And then he goes on and talks about how he's going to do this and gather the elders, and they will listen to him. Of course, that doesn't help. Moses says, okay, I'm going to tell them that you're sending me, but they're not going to believe me. What makes you think they're going to believe me? And this is where God appears to Moses and gives him 3 different miracles that he's going to use. Now, I'm sure this is not what Moses had, but this is, other than bringing a shovel or a rake, this is what I've got in my garage that, God says, what's that in your hand? Well, it's my staff. I'm a shepherd. Throw it on the ground. Turns into a snake. And then tells him, pick it up by the tail. Yeah, I'm looking forward to picking up a snake by the tail. Picks it up, turns it back into a rod again. He says, put your hand in your cloak. Okay, see, this is where the coat comes in. Otherwise I would have had to unbutton my shirt, and nobody wanted me to do that here. So put my hand in the cloak, and he says, pull it out. And his hand is leprous, full of leprosy. Put your hand back in. Puts his hand back in, pull it back out, and his hand is healed. And then he says, you're also going to be able to turn water to blood. So you have these 3 signs to show you that God is with you. And so now he's got the ability to do miraculous things. He's never had that before, but he's still hitting God up with these excuses. Next thing he says is, I don't speak so good. I'm sure Moses, back when he was in the day in Egypt, he probably had some speech classes. And I remember those speech classes. They weren't the most fun. Freshman year of college, and you're having to take speech in front of people you don't know. Why'd they do that to us? And Moses tries to use that as an excuse. So God says, all right, God's being very patient with him. We're gonna pull your brother Aaron along into this, and Aaron's going to be your spokesman. But, if you read through the entire story of God and Moses and Pharaoh, you see that it doesn't take long at all until Moses is not using Aaron anymore. I mean, Aaron's still there, but Aaron and Pharaoh are eventually, they're going to start going at it themselves. Moses doesn't need Aaron. He thinks he does. But God's, okay, we're going to give you this other. And you can use Aaron as your spokesman. But then we get to the heart of the issue, and it's in verse 13 of chapter 4, where finally Moses says, "My Lord, please send someone else. Just please send someone else. I don't want to do this." And we're told that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And Moses basically is told, this is what I have for you. He explains that the plan is already being put in place. Aaron is going to come out into the desert, and he's going to find Moses there at the mountain. They're going to have a reunion. Then they're going to go back to Egypt together. They're going to meet with the elders of the nation. And the very last verse of chapter 4 tells us that, and the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. There's excitement, but their first response when they find out that God is going to start working in this specific area is that they're going to worship. And God even promises to Moses, there's going to be times here over these next couple weeks, months, we don't know exactly how long this lasts, with the plagues that are going to hit Egypt, that Pharaoh's not going to listen, and he's not going to cooperate, and God's going to show these miraculous signs of how great he is, and finally lead his nation out of Egypt. But it all starts with an invitation to one man who's not expecting it, who doesn't feel qualified to come and do a great task for God. And that happens to us often. Because anything that God is asking us to do is a great task. It's not a case of, well, I could never get up and preach. God's probably not calling you to get up and preach. But what God is calling you to do, in whatever situation he's asking you to be involved in, that's a great and important task for God and for the ministry. And so don't ever think of it as, well, what I'm doing is not important. What I'm doing is insignificant. I think Paul makes that really clear that that's not the case when he uses the illustrations there in Corinthians about the parts of the body and how every part is necessary and every part plays a role in the outworking of a physical body as well as the outworking of a local church. And so think about it, pray about it. Where do you fit in? I know that's something that Pastor Sanders is talking about, working through, as we're going to hear a little bit more about it as we go through the book of Jonah. But as we are here looking at this, and as we understand that God's not calling me to lead a 2.5 million group of people out of the nation of Egypt, but he does have something. We've all, as believers, we've all been given at least one spiritual gift. And the spiritual gift has been given for us to use in the context of a local church. I strongly believe that God has enabled each one of us to be able to do something in service for him. Sometimes it takes a little bit of prodding on our part. Sometimes it takes the observation of someone else to maybe come alongside of you and say, you're just a natural at this. Have you ever thought about maybe serving or or helping in this ministry. And maybe it's something you didn't even think about, but it's something that other people see in your life that, I don't mean that you're good at, but that you enjoy, or that you naturally would be an awesome person to serve in a certain area. And many times God calls us and uses us because we've been pointed out or reminded from somebody else that, hey, you could fit in here. Because he's got a place for everybody, every single one of us. So in conclusion, let me just remind you that God does care about your situation. If you're going through something right now, you're struggling, God knows about it. God's not leaving you in the lurch. Rest in him. Rest in his promises. Don't be afraid to talk about things with others, with believers, with friends who can help work you through things. We have a great system here in the church of our small groups, where we get to know one another in our small groups, and even better relationships, where we're able to even hold one another accountable in things like this. But we also are able to support. I know one of the jokes in our small group is, I don't know why, but I start my responsibilities across the street as a teacher at 8 o'clock. Homeroom starts at 8 o'clock. Well, for some reason, somebody in our small group will inevitably start a text chain at 8 o'clock. And then all of a sudden, my phone is just blowing up over the next 45 minutes. And Louise is sitting back here laughing, because probably her half the time. But it'd be prayer requests, or how can we help here, or what's going on here? How can we pray for this? And we're keeping each other informed. It's a neat thing. So if you're not involved that way, I encourage you to do that as well. But God's involved. God's involved in our lives, and he wants us to be involved in his ministry. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this message that you have given to me and spoke to me. I pray, Lord, that you would work in our hearts. Help us to understand where we fit in. Help us to understand your absolute involvement in our personal lives, in our personal walk, and that we all have a place. We all have a role. We pray this in Jesus' name, amen.